When we're conducting epidemiological studies, we are just looking at associations between our variables of interest. So we're looking typically at the association between some independent variable or maybe multiple variables, and that relationship with an outcome or dependent variable. When we observe associations, just because we see an association does not mean that it's a causal association. And there's a lot of different types of associations that can exist. So just because you see that a statistical association is there, it doesn't mean that it's a causal association. This figure from your textbook kind of provides almost like a pathway or kind of a list of options in terms of when you see associations, what kinds of associations that might exist. So if you observe that your variables aren't associated, that would be assuming that they're completely independent. So you wouldn't observe an association. But if you do observe an association, what you can see is that if you do, if you look in the center, that center row, it says yes. If yes, what kind of association? So if you're observing a statistical association between two variables, it's possible that it's a non-causal association, or it's possible that it is a causal association. And if there's a causal association, it's possible that it's an indirect association or it could be a direct association. So let's talk about an example from your book. Your book provides this example of sugar consumption and diabetes. In this example, sugar consumption is going to be our independent variable. It's our exposure that we're looking at. And type 2 diabetes is going to be our dependent variable. It's our outcome we're interested in understanding. So we might collect our data, we analyze that data, and we might find that there's no association between dietary sugar consumption and the occurrence of diabetes. That is a possibility. However, it is also possible that when we analyze that data, we maybe do find an association between sugar consumption and diabetes. We might see a positive association where you observe basically that the more sugar you consume, the higher the risk is for developing type 2 diabetes. That would be a positive association. If you observe an association, it's possible that it's a non-causal association. It could be a random event, or it could be what we call a secondary association. You might be seeing that this variable here, sugar consumption, we're seeing this association with diabetes, not because it's a causal relationship, but because there's some third factor, which happens to be genetic predisposition, that is related to both the independent and the dependent variable that causes us to see an association, but it's not a causal association. So it's also possible that if you find a statistical association between your variables, it's possible that there's a causal association. You can have an indirect causal relationship where you have your independent variable and then there's some other variable that falls on that pathway on the relationship between that independent variable and that dependent variable. So in our example here, we have this causal pathway where it says indirect, and what you see is that you have sugar consumption that leads to obesity, which then leads to diabetes. So there is a causal relationship between sugar consumption and diabetes. However, it's an indirect causal association because there's another variable that falls on that pathway. Or it's possible that you could have a direct causal association where sugar consumption actually just causes or produces diabetes. So in summary, there's a lot of different types of associations that can exist if you find a statistical association between an independent and a dependent variable. Just because you find a statistical association, it doesn't mean that it's a direct causal association. If you find an association between variables, it could be non-causal. As we talked about, there's some third variable that's related to your independent and your dependent variable that makes it look like there's this association, but it's not actually a causal association. You could also have a causal association, but then thinking about a causal association, you could, under that category, you can have an indirect association or a direct association. So just because you find an association does not mean that it's a causal association. And trying to establish a causal association is a very difficult, complex thing to do. In the next part of this module, we're going to talk about some of the criteria that we use to actually establish causality between our variables.